The Queen's champion mocked human soldiers during first contact, until one stepped forward. The alien fleet did not arrive with fire. That surprised everyone. For the better part of a decade, humanity had been quietly preparing for the mathematical inevitability of first contact. Not out of optimism, but out of the same grim institutional logic that builds seawalls before the storm arrives. The Threshold Station program had been a joint enterprise between the surviving major space agencies and a loose coalition of defense contractors, funded by governments who publicly denied its purpose and privately tripled its budget every 18 months. Threshold Station Kilo 7 sat at the gravitational midpoint between Earth's moon and the L2 Lagrange point, far enough from Earth to be defensible, close enough to feel the weight of what it was protecting. Its construction had taken 11 years, its crew complement rotated every 8 months, and its communication arrays could punch a signal through 17 light minutes of interference. It was not a military installation by any legal definition. The United Earth Governance Charter was very specific about that. The people who staffed it carried weapons. Commander Yael Ostrovsky was midway through her second cup of synthetic coffee when the proximity alarm activated, not the piercing emergency tone, but the lower, sustained pulse that meant something large had crossed the outermost detection boundary. She set the cup down without spilling it. That detail would appear in 3 separate after-action reports, cited as evidence of her composure. She always thought it was just habit. "How many?" she asked, already moving toward the operations center. Lieutenant Adiz Nwolfer was pulling up the sensor array before the commander finished the question. 31 distinct signatures. Possibly more. The gravitational displacement suggests mass in the range of... She paused, recalculated, paused again. Approximately 40 to 60 times our largest carrier-class vessels. Per unit. Ostrovsky absorbed that without visible reaction. 31 ships. Each one potentially 60 times the size of the UES Resolute, which humanity had spent 9 years and 4 international treaties building. The Resolute was currently stationed 18,000 kilometers away. It was, by any honest measure, the most powerful warship the human species had ever constructed. It suddenly felt very small. "Get me Admiral Reyes," Ostrovsky said, and scrambled the diplomatic protocol team. "All of them. Already on it. And Commander?" Nwolfer's voice carried something careful in it. "They're not accelerating toward us." They stopped. At exactly the boundary marker. Ostrovsky looked up from the tactical display. The boundary markers were the result of 3 years of mathematical modeling, game theory analysis, and diplomatic philosophy workshops attended by people who had never expected to actually use what they were designing. The markers were broadcast on every frequency humanity knew how to generate, a clear spatial limit, a message in physics rather than language. "This is where you stop if you want to talk." They had stopped. "They read the markers," Nwolfer said quietly. "Or they have the same instincts we do about approach distance," Ostrovsky replied. She didn't say which option worried her more. The fleet that humanity now designated the Veilhari Convergence, a name assigned by the linguistics team based on the phonemic patterns of the first signals received, had emerged from what the astrophysics community would spend the next decade arguing about. The leading theory was a form of spatial compression transit, not faster-than-light travel in any classical sense, but something closer to folding the intervening distance like a map. The energy requirements were, by human estimation, extraordinary. The fact that the Veilhari could do it at all told humanity something important. They were not peers. That assessment came from Dr. Kamila Brzezinski, the station's senior xenotechnology analyst, within 6 hours of the fleet's arrival. Her full briefing was 47 pages. Her summary was one sentence: "We are not dealing with a civilization at our level." The question that kept Ostrovsky awake through that first night was the one nobody wanted to say aloud. Did that mean the Veilhari saw humanity as a threat, a curiosity, a resource, or something so far beneath their consideration that they hadn't yet decided? The first transmission arrived at 0340 station time. It was not a greeting. It was not a threat. It was, as the linguistics team would determine after 14 hours of analysis, something closer to an administrative announcement. A declaration of presence. A statement of intent to observe established protocols, whatever those might be, followed by a request, structured in the precise formal grammar of a species accustomed to being obeyed, for humanity to designate a representative. Not a government representative. Not a scientific representative. The Veilhari had a specific word for what they wanted. It took the linguistics team another 6 hours to translate it with confidence. They wanted a champion. The concept, as it emerged through further communication, was not metaphorical. The Veilhari operated within a system of hierarchical representation that was simultaneously diplomatic and deeply ceremonial. When two civilizations met for the first time under the Convergence's protocols, each designated a single individual to stand in formal assessment. This was not combat. The Veilhari were careful to make that distinction repeatedly, with a consistency that suggested they'd had misunderstandings about this point before. It was something older and more complicated than combat. It was demonstration. Each civilization's champion would represent the essential qualities of their species. Not strength alone, not intelligence alone, but something the Veilhari called Veilith, which the linguistics team translated as a compound concept somewhere between standing, worth, and demonstrated nature. The assessment was observed by the Convergence's senior figures and used to determine how, or whether, formal relations would proceed. Humanity had 72 hours to designate its representative. The diplomatic team spent the first 48 of those hours arguing about what the Veilhari actually meant, whether the process could be postponed, whether it set a dangerous precedent, and whether the entire concept was a kind of elaborate cultural test in itself. The military liaison spent those same 48 hours quietly compiling a different kind of list. His name was Colonel Darius Nkemdarim, and he had been attached to Threshold Station Kilo 7 for reasons that the official roster described as strategic advisory capacity, and which everyone understood to mean that someone in the chain of command had thought it might be useful, someday, to have someone present who had spent his career thinking about what you do when the situation has no good options. He brought his list to Ostrovsky on hour 49. It had one name on it. She read the name. She read the attached file. She read it again. "This person," she said carefully, "is a corporal." "Yes," Nkemdarim said. "The Veilhari sent their queen's personal champion. A figure that, by our translation, holds a position equivalent to the highest martial representative in their entire civilization." "Yes." Ostrovsky set the file down. Outside the viewport, 31 ships the size of city districts hung in perfect stillness against the dark. "Tell me why," she said. Nkemdarim sat down across from her, and for the next 40 minutes he did exactly that. Her name, translated through 4 layers of linguistic interpretation and rendered into something human vocal anatomy could approximate, was Vane Sorithkale. Humanity's briefing team called her the champion. The Veilhari called her something that translated most accurately as the Queen's Proof, a title that had existed, according to the cultural data the Convergence began transmitting on hour 53, for approximately 400 years. The current holder had held it for 31 of them. She was not the largest being the xenobiology team had ever theorized about. She was not, by the available sensor data, a creature of impossible physical dimensions or supernatural capability. The Veilhari were bipedal, bilaterally symmetrical, approximately 2.5 meters in height on average, with a physiology the medical analysts described as highly optimized for sustained performance under variable gravitational and atmospheric conditions. Their bone density was remarkable. Their musculature operated on different biochemical principles than human muscle. Slower to peak but dramatically more resistant to fatigue. They did not tire the way humans did. That was the first thing Dr. Brzezinski flagged in her update to the briefing team. Human physical performance, she explained during the 0600 briefing, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who had not slept, follows a curve. Peak output for a short duration, then degradation. Our sprint capacity is exceptional by most theoretical modeling. Our endurance over sustained high output periods is also exceptional, arguably among the highest of any known animal physiology on Earth. But the degradation curve is real. It exists. The Veilhari physiology, based on what we can model from the sensor data, has a much shallower degradation curve. Not better peak output. Better sustained output. "So they don't tire," said the military liaison from the back of the room. "They tire more slowly," Brzezinski corrected carefully. "Over a long enough timeline, the distinction may not matter." Colonel Nkemdarim said nothing. He was looking at a different portion of the data, not the physiology charts, but the behavioral profiles the intelligence team had compiled from 4 days of passive observation of the Convergence fleet. He had been looking at these profiles for most of the previous night. Vane Sorithkale's first formal transmission to Threshold Station Kilo 7 was not a greeting. The Veilhari did not, as far as the linguistics team could determine, have a conventional greeting structure. What they had instead was acknowledgement, a statement of mutual recognition that carried no warmth and no hostility, simply the precise notation of presence and status. The champion's transmission contained 3 components. The first was a statement of her credentials, Her lineage within the Convergence's martial hierarchy, her record of service to the Queen's court, her designation and the authority it carried. The linguistics team needed 11 hours to fully translate this section. When they finished, they were quiet for a long time. Vane Sorethkale had participated in formal assessment ceremonies, the equivalent of this first contact protocol, 47 times. 47 times, across 47 separate civilizations. How many of those resulted in positive diplomatic relations? Ostrovsky asked. The team lead checked her notes. 31. A pause settled over the briefing room. What happened to the other 16? The commander asked. No one answered immediately. Eventually, the linguistics team lead said, the records we have access to don't describe outcomes in terms we've fully translated yet. But the word that appears most consistently in association with those 16 encounters is one that our best current interpretation renders as reclassified. The room was very quiet. Reclassified as what? Someone asked. That's what we haven't been able to determine. The second component of the champion's transmission was a formal description of the assessment process, provided as a courtesy, which itself told the Xenoculture team something significant. The Veilhari were operating under the assumption that humanity did not know the protocols. That assumption implied they believed this was genuinely first contact, not a reconnection with a known species. It also implied they had done this often enough to develop a standard explanation. The process as described was not a contest. That distinction was made with the same careful repetition that had appeared in every Veilhari communication about the topic. Whatever the assessment was, the Convergence was deliberate about separating it from any concept of combat. The champion would not fight. The human representative would not fight. There would be no violence. What there would be was witness. The assessment, as best the team could understand it, was a formal presentation, a demonstration conducted by each representative in turn, observed by the Convergence's senior diplomatic and martial council. The nature of the demonstration was not specified. The champion would demonstrate first. The human representative would follow. The council would observe. They would confer. They would reach a determination about the nature of the civilization being represented. And based on that determination, they would decide what the Veilhari Convergence's relationship with humanity would be. 47 times, Vane Sorethkale had stood before unknown civilizations and demonstrated what the Convergence was. 31 times, those civilizations had been given the opportunity to continue existing on their own terms. The third component of the transmission was the only moment in 4 days of communication where anything resembling emotion entered the Veilhari's tone. Was a question. The linguistic team debated its precise translation for 6 hours. The best consensus rendering was, "We have observed your communications for some time. Before we proceed, do you understand what you are?" Commander Ostrovsky read the translation 3 times. She took it to Colonel Nkemderim, who read it once. "What does that mean?" she asked. "I think," he said slowly, "it means they've been listening to us long enough to form an impression. And they want to know if our impression of ourselves matches theirs." "And does it?" He was quiet for a moment. "That depends on who we send." He set his file on the table between them, the same file with the single name on it. "I've been thinking about this since the first transmission," he said. "The Veilhari champion has done this 47 times. She knows every performance. She knows what ambition looks like when it's dressed up as strength. She knows what fear looks like when it's dressed up as confidence. She has spent 31 years watching representatives stand up and try to be what they think their civilization should be." He tapped the file. "We shouldn't send someone trying to represent what humanity aspires to be. We should send someone who is simply what we actually are. Undisguised. Unperformed. Exactly as we are when no one important is watching." Ostrovsky looked at the name again. Corporal Emeke 26 years old. Third-generation military family, Lagos. Deployed twice to the Martian infrastructure corridors during the civil engineering conflicts of 2087. Decorated once for a decision that his commanding officer had described in the citation as technically outside protocol and unambiguously correct. His psych profile contained a phrase that appeared 3 times across 4 different evaluating officers. Does not perform under observation, behaves identically whether observed or not. "He's going to think we're joking," Ostrovsky said. "Yes," Nkemderim agreed. "And that's exactly why." Corporal Emeke had been on Threshold Station Kilo 7 for 6 weeks when Commander Ostrovsky summoned him to the operations center. He had been assigned to the station's security rotation, one of 12 personnel responsible for the internal safety protocols of a facility that had never, in 11 years of operation, experienced a security incident of any significance. It was, by any honest assessment, not a posting that carried much drama. Ease had spent his 6 weeks running drills, maintaining equipment, eating synthetic food that approximated Nigerian cuisine with roughly 60% accuracy, and reading. He read extensively. His bunk contained, at the time of the summons, 23 physical books, an eccentricity his bunkmates found endearing rather than strange, and a tablet loaded with approximately 800 more. His tastes ran toward history, structural engineering, and, with a consistency that his commanding officer had noted in a quarterly review, military philosophy. Not tactics. Not strategy in the operational sense. Philosophy. Clausewitz. Sun Tzu. Less familiar names: Ardent Dupik, John Boyd, a contemporary theorist named Adesanya whose work on decision-making under uncertainty had been published 6 years prior to a modest academic reception and which Ease had read 4 times. He arrived at the operations center at 1400 station time, in his standard uniform, without apparent concern about why he had been summoned. Commander Ostrovsky noted later that he knocked before entering. The briefing took 90 minutes. Ostrovsky and Kemderim took turns. The linguistics team lead, Dr. Priya Anand, filled in the translation details. Ease sat across the table from 3 of the most senior people on the station and listened without interrupting for 68 of those 90 minutes. He asked 4 questions. The first 3 were clarifying, about the precision of the translations, about the sensor data underlying the physiology assessments, about the specific wording of the Veilhari term Veilith. He asked to hear the original audio of the champion's transmission. Anand played it for him. He listened to 4 minutes of it, then nodded once. The 4th question came after Ostrovsky explained why he had been selected. He was quiet for a moment after she finished. Then, "You want someone who won't perform." "Correct," Nkemderim said. "But you're asking me to perform the role of someone who doesn't perform." A short silence. "That's a problem," Ease said. It was not a complaint. It was a structural observation, delivered in the same tone he might use to note that a doorway was 2 centimeters narrower than the equipment that needed to pass through it. "We're aware," Ostrovsky said. "We don't have a clean solution to it." Ease considered this for a moment. "What exactly is the assessment? What does the champion actually do?" Anand pulled up the translated description. "We don't have a complete picture. The Veilhari provided the framework but not the specific content. What we understand is that it's a demonstration. The champion will demonstrate something representative of her civilization's nature. Then you respond in kind. So it's improvisational." "Structurally, yes. And we have no idea what she'll demonstrate." "No." Ease looked at the table for a moment, then back up. "What's our theory about the 16 civilizations that were reclassified?" Nkemderim and Ostrovsky exchanged a brief glance. It was Nkemderim who answered. "We have several theories. The most consistent one, based on the cultural data we've been able to analyze, is that the Veilhari are evaluating for something specific. Not power. Not technological level. If that were the criterion, the outcome would be straightforward and they wouldn't need an assessment at all. Something more qualitative. Judgment," Ease said. Another pause. "That's the working hypothesis," Nkemderim said carefully. "The capacity for judgment under uncertainty," Ease clarified. "Not strength. Not intelligence as raw processing. The ability to make a decision when you don't have complete information and the consequences are real." He paused. "That's what they're looking for. Whether a civilization can actually think, not just react." The room was quiet for a moment. "We arrived at a similar conclusion," Anand said. "Though it took us considerably longer." Ease nodded slowly, the way someone does when they're not congratulating themselves but simply confirming that the map matches the territory. "When do I meet her?" 41 hours, Ostrovsky said. "I'd like access to everything you have on the Veilhari. All of it. And I'd like to speak with Dr. Brzezinski about the physiology data." "Of course." He stood, straightened his uniform, a reflex clearly habitual rather than performed, and then paused at the door. "One more question." "Go ahead." "The 31 civilizations that were assessed positively. Do we know anything about what their representatives did?" Anand shook her head. "The Veilhari records we have access to don't include that level of detail." Ease considered this. "Then we don't know if there's a pattern." "No." "Good," he said simply. "If there was a pattern, we'd try to replicate it. And she'd recognize that immediately." He paused. "Whatever I do, it has to be something I'd actually do. Not something I've decided to do because it seems like the right answer." He left. The door closed behind him. Ostrovsky looked at Nkemderim. Did we make the right call? The colonel picked up his coffee. Ask me in 41 hours. Over the following day and a half, Corporal Ease made requests that the station staff found, variously, surprising, inexplicable, and in one case mildly alarming. He asked for the complete engineering schematics of Threshold Station Kilo 7. He asked for the full historical record of every human first contact theory, not plan theory, that had been academically published between 2041 and the present. He asked Dr. Brzezinski 3 hours of questions about Veilhari sensory perception, specifically whether the available data suggested any difference between how they processed visual information versus acoustic information. He asked to spend 4 hours in the station's zero-gravity maintenance corridor alone, which was unusual enough that the security rotation flagged it and Ostrovsky personally reviewed the corridor footage afterward. He had spent the time sitting quietly, occasionally making notes in a physical notebook, and at one point standing at the observation port for 40 minutes without moving, looking at the Veilhari fleet. He did not practice anything that looked like a performance. He did not rehearse. He did not, as far as anyone could observe, appear nervous. What he did on the morning of the assessment was eat breakfast, real eggs processed from the station's protein synthesis unit, approximating scrambled eggs with perhaps 70% accuracy, and then sit with Dr. Anand for 2 hours, going through every translated fragment of Veilhari cultural data the team had compiled, asking specific questions about linguistic nuance rather than content. You're not asking what they said, Anand observed at one point. You're asking how they said it. Yes, he said. Why? He set down the tablet. Because what someone chooses to say tells you what they want you to know. How they say it tells you what they actually think. Anand looked at him for a moment. What does the champion's transmission tell you? About what she actually thinks. Ease was quiet for a moment. She's tired, he said. Not physically. She's been doing this for 31 years. 47 assessments. She's looking for something she hasn't found yet. Or something she's afraid she won't find. Anand considered that. What makes you think that? The question she sent. Do you understand what you are? He paused. That's not a challenge. It's not a test question. Someone who's confident in the outcome doesn't ask that. They already know the answer and they're waiting to confirm it. He looked at the tablet again. She actually wants to know. The transfer vessel was Veilhari, a small, precisely engineered craft that arrived at Threshold Station's docking approach at exactly the designated time, which the navigation team noted with the particular unease of people encountering a civilization that was never late. It was not a shuttle in any human sense. It had no visible propulsion system the engineering team could identify with confidence. It moved with a smoothness that suggested either extraordinary inertial control or a fundamentally different relationship with momentum. The docking interface it presented was adaptable, a detail that told Dr. Brzezinski's team something important about how often the Veilhari did this. They had done it enough to build universal compatibility into their transfer craft. Corporal Ease walked to the docking bay at 0900 station time. He was wearing his standard uniform. No dress uniform. The question had been raised and he had quietly declined, pointing out that the Veilhari had no context for the distinction and that performing formality for an audience that couldn't read it served no purpose. He carried nothing. No weapon, no equipment, no gift or diplomatic token. The protocol team had spent 6 hours debating whether he should bring something and he had listened to the full debate before saying that bringing an object whose significance the Veilhari couldn't interpret was noise, not signal, and that he'd rather arrive empty-handed than carry something meaningless. Commander Ostrovsky walked with him to the docking bay. Last chance to change your mind about going alone, she said. I'm not going to, he said. It was not bravado. He had explained his reasoning twice already. The Veilhari had specified a single representative, the champion traveled alone, and sending a retinue would signal either that humanity didn't understand the protocol or that Ease personally required support. Neither impression was useful. At the entrance to the docking bay, Ostrovsky stopped him with a hand on his arm. Ease. She paused, not sure what she wanted to say. Come back. He nodded once. Commander. He looked at her for a moment. The station logs everything, right? All of it? Yes. Good. He didn't explain. He walked through the docking bay door. The interior of the transfer vessel was not what the engineering team had theorized. The cultural preparation briefings had suggested the Veilhari favored enclosed, relatively low-light environments. An inference drawn from the minimal external illumination of their fleet and the spectral profile of the lighting visible through hull sensors. The reality was more nuanced. The transfer vessel's interior was lit in a spectrum that shifted subtly toward the infrared end of human perception. Not dark, exactly, but warmer and deeper than standard human lighting, like the last half hour of daylight on a clear afternoon. The space was larger than the vessel's exterior dimensions had suggested was possible. Another data point for the theoretical physicists aboard Kilo 7, who would later spend months arguing about it. There were no seats in any human configuration. There were structural surfaces at varying heights that were clearly intended for beings that stood rather than sat, platforms and graduated surfaces that the translation of an accompanying text panel described. Once Ease photographed it and transmitted the image to the station as resting architecture. The Veilhari did not sit. They braced. He stood. The transit took 11 minutes. He spent most of it at the viewport, a material that looked like nothing he could identify, neither glass nor polymer, perfectly transparent, watching the fleet grow larger. 31 ships. At this proximity, the scale was different than it had been on the sensor display. The sensor display was data. This was geometry. The nearest ship was large enough that even at what he estimated was several kilometers of distance, its curvature was visible, a horizon made of engineered metal and materials whose composition the spectrographic team had not yet determined. He thought about the question the champion had asked. Do you understand what you are? He had been thinking about it for 40 hours. Not anxiously. He had noticed the absence of anxiety, catalogued it, and set it aside as a data point about his own psychology rather than a quality judgment. He wasn't certain whether the absence of anxiety was a strength or a calibration error on his part. Both were possible. What he kept coming back to was the question's specificity. What you are. Not what you can do. Not what you want. Not what you have achieved. The Veilhari champion, who had conducted this assessment 47 times with 47 different civilizations, had not asked about capability or accomplishment. She had asked about self-knowledge. The flagship, Ease had no better word for it. The Veilhari term the linguistics team had translated was closer to the Queen's extended presence, was designated Vessel Prime in human documentation. It was approximately 4 kilometers along its primary axis, with a cross-section that the structural engineers had modeled as approximately ovoid, though the surface geometry was complex enough that the model had significant error margins. The docking procedure was automated. The transfer vessel guided itself through an aperture in the flagship's hull that opened precisely enough to admit it and no more, closed behind it with a sound that transmitted through the hull as a deep, resonant tone, and came to rest in a bay that was organized with the particular efficiency of a civilization that did not waste space. Ease was met by 2 figures. Not the champion. The protocol transmitted by the Veilhari had specified that the champion and the representative would meet in the assessment chamber itself, not before. What the Veilhari provided were something the briefing team had translated as conductors, a word that carried connotations of both musical direction and electrical transmission, which the Xenoculture team had found either profound or confusing depending on their disposition. The conductors were smaller than the sensor data had suggested Veilhari average, approximately 2 meters, with the same bilateral symmetry and bone density heavy build the analysts had predicted. Their coloration was a deep gray-green that the exobiology team had theorized served some thermoregulatory function. They wore no visible equipment. They looked at Ease with eyes that were slightly larger than human proportion and set wider on a face that was broader and flatter than human anatomy, and they looked at him with an expression that the briefing team had not given him a framework for reading. He looked back at them calmly. One of them produced a sound, not quite speech, not quite tone, something between, and then paused. Ease waited. The sound repeated, with a slight variation at the end that he recognized from 40 hours of studying the translated audio files, as the Veilhari phonemic marker for a question. He had prepared for this. Not with a scripted response. Scripted responses required performing, and he had made a decision about performing, but with an acknowledgement. He pressed one hand flat against his chest and held it there for a moment. I am what is here. I am present. It was a gesture he had extrapolated from the cultural data, not guaranteed to mean anything to the Veilhari, but grounded in something real. It was what humans did in many cultures, when they wanted to indicate sincerity rather than representation. Not I speak for but I am. The 2 conductors were still for a moment. Then one of them repeated the gesture, hand flat against chest, with a precision that suggested observation and deliberate replication. And then they turned and walked and he followed. The corridors of the flagship were not built for human comfort and made no concession toward it. The lighting was the same deep warm spectrum as the transfer vessel. The ceiling height was calibrated for beings 2.5 meters tall, which meant Ease, at 1.83 meters, moved through spaces that felt slightly too large in the vertical dimension, like walking through a building designed for a different human proportion. The floors were not flat. They sloped and terraced in ways that the engineering team would later determine served a structural purpose related to the ship's internal gravity management. Moving through them required a continuous, subtle recalibration of balance that Ease handled without visible difficulty, having spent 6 weeks on a station that had its own idiosyncratic gravitational gradients. He counted corridors. He noted junctions. He cataloged details with the habit of someone trained to build situational awareness in unfamiliar environments, not for tactical purposes, simply because it was what he did when he was somewhere new. The assessment chamber was at the center of the ship. He knew it before the conductor stopped, because the corridor opened into a space that was qualitatively different from everything he had walked through. Not larger, or not only larger, but different in the way that some rooms are different from other rooms regardless of their size. The acoustics changed. The light changed. There was a quality to the silence that was different from the functional silence of the corridors. And standing at the center of the chamber, looking at him with the wide-set eyes of a being who had done this 47 times, was Vane Sorethkale, the Queen's champion. She was taller than average, perhaps 2.7 meters, and her posture carried a quality that had nothing to do with physical size. She had been doing this for 31 years. It was present in the way she occupied space, the way she had already assessed him before he crossed the threshold of the room, the way her expression, readable once you spent 40 hours studying the data, contained something he had not fully expected. Not contempt. Not superiority. Recognition. Her expression said in no language at all. You are something I haven't seen before. The chamber had no furniture, no screens, no equipment visible to human eyes. It was a space designed for presence, not props. The walls curved inward in a geometry that the engineering team, reviewing Ease's recording afterward, determined was acoustically precise. Any sound made in this room would travel to every point within it equally, without echo, without delay. The chamber was a listening instrument. Everything said or done within it would be received with equal clarity by everyone present. Around the perimeter of the chamber, elevated on a graduated structure that created a natural amphitheater, were seated, braced in Veilhari posture, 17 figures. The Queen's Council. The senior diplomatic and martial observers whose assessment would determine what happened next. Ease noted them. He did not acknowledge them with any particular gesture. He looked at the champion instead. She was looking at him with the same expression he had catalogued in the corridor, that quality of recognition, as though she had expected something and found something slightly different. She spoke first. The sound was not directed at him. It carried to the council, to the conductors who had remained near the entrance, and it carried to a translation interface that had been positioned at the chamber's edge and which transmitted to the earpiece Ease wore. The linguistics team on Kilo 7 would receive the same audio feed with a 6-second delay. The translation came through imperfect but usable. We meet in the place of witness. I am the Queen's proof. I stand for the convergence and all it has built across its history. You are the witness of another people. You stand for all they are. She paused. Looked at him directly. I will show you what we are. Then you will show me what you are. The council will hold what they observe. This is the protocol. Ease gave a single clear nod. She accepted this. And then Vane Sorethkale, the Queen's champion, the being who had conducted this assessment 47 times across 400 years of Veilhari diplomatic history, did something that the entire crew of Threshold Station Kilo 7 watched on delayed transmission and then watched again in complete silence. She sat down. Not in the Veilhari bracing posture. Not in any formal position. She lowered herself to the chamber floor, the actual floor at the same level as Ease, and she sat in the posture of someone resting. No performance in it. No ceremony. Simply a being who had been standing for a long time and had chosen, in this moment, to stop. Then she began to speak. The translation came in fragments. The linguistics team working in real time, Dr. Anand's voice tightly controlled in Ease's earpiece. It was not a speech. It was not a declaration of the Veilhari's power or history or achievements. What it was, as best the translation could render it, was a description. She described the first world the Convergence had ever encountered. Not the first contact. The world itself. A planet orbiting a star in what humanity's charts designated the Cygnus Arm. A world that had been, when the Veilhari found it, already dead. Not destroyed by violence. Dead by the slower mechanism of a civilization that had consumed beyond its capacity for renewal and had not recognized the threshold until it was already past it. The Veilhari had arrived to find ruins and a climate in collapse and the last data transmissions of a species that had been, by all evidence, intelligent and creative and genuinely remarkable. Too late. By 400 years. She described what the convergence had done with that discovery. Not militarily, not diplomatically, the Veilhari had not yet developed their assessment protocol at that point. What they had done was record. Every fragment of the dead civilization's data that could be recovered was recovered. Every artifact. Every transmission. A civilization that had existed for 11,000 years and produced art and mathematics and philosophy of genuine complexity was preserved in Veilhari archives because there was no one left to preserve it themselves. And then she described the second world. And the third. And the seventh. Each time, a civilization found, a civilization observed, an assessment conducted. Sometimes the assessment had led to relations that the Veilhari considered genuinely collaborative. Civilizations that had understood the convergence's protocols and engaged with them on their own terms. Sometimes it had not. The Veilhari did not elaborate on what not meant. She didn't need to. The silence that occupied the space where that elaboration would have gone communicated something more precise than words. What the champion was demonstrating, Ease realized after approximately 10 minutes of listening, was not strength. She was demonstrating weight. The weight of having done this long enough to know what it cost. The weight of being the mechanism through which one civilization decides whether another one continues. The weight of having found 47 worlds and knowing that 31 of them had been, by some definition, enough, and knowing what that implied about the other 16. She spoke for 22 minutes. At the end she was quiet for a moment, looking at the chamber floor. Then she looked up at Ease. This is what we carry, the translation rendered. This is the nature of the convergence. We do not come to conquer. We come to determine whether the next civilization will be one we find alive or one we find afterward, an archive. Pause. The question I asked you, whether you understand what you are, is not a challenge. It is the most important question I know how to ask. Because every civilization I have encountered has understood itself incompletely. And the ones that understood themselves least accurately were the ones least prepared for what comes with contact. She met his eyes. What comes with contact is consequence. Every civilization that knows we exist must now exist in a universe where we exist. That changes things. Some civilizations cannot hold that weight. They collapse inward or they reach outward too fast or they freeze. The ones that can hold it, the ones that already had some practice bearing the weight of a universe that does not arrange itself for their convenience, those are the ones worth standing beside. She waited. The chamber was completely silent. Now she said, "Show me what you are." Ease was quiet for a moment. Not performing consideration. Actually considering. On Kilo 7 the entire linguistics team, Dr. Brzezinski, Colonel Nkemderim, and Commander Ostrovsky were watching the delayed transmission in the operations center. No one spoke. Ostrovsky had her hands flat on the console in front of her. Nkemderim was very still. Ease looked at the champion. And then he did something none of them had anticipated. He also sat down. Same level. Same posture. Not mirroring hers precisely but the same fundamental choice. The floor, not the position of formal address. He sat the way he sat when he was reading. Settled. Present. Not performing ease, simply occupying it. And then, without preamble or diplomatic framing, he said, "In 2041, a scientist named Ewan Ferris calculated the statistical probability that our species would be extinct within 400 years if we didn't change 17 specific things about how we were living. The calculation was not controversial among the people who checked it. What was controversial was what to do about it." He paused. "I'm going to tell you what actually happened after that. Not the version that makes us look good. The actual version." The Ewan Ferris assessment had been published in 2041 in a journal that reached, at the time of publication, approximately 14,000 subscribers. By 2043, it had been read by an estimated 900 million people. By 2045, it had been translated into every major human language, debated in 11 legislative bodies, denounced by 3 governments as alarmist propaganda, cited by 2 others as the basis for emergency environmental legislation, and quietly integrated into the strategic planning documents of every major military organization on Earth, each of which had independently reached the conclusion that a civilization approaching extinction has predictable behavioral patterns and those patterns are not peaceful. Emeka Ease explained this to the Queen's champion in plain language. He did not dramatize it. He did not frame it as a story of human triumph or resilience. He described it the way someone describes a structural problem they lived through, with the particular honesty of a person who was present for parts of it and has read carefully about the parts they weren't. The first response was denial, he said. Not universal denial. There were people who accepted the assessment immediately and began working on the problem within weeks of publication. But the institutional response, across most of our major governing bodies, was to dispute the methodology. Not because the methodology was actually wrong, but because accepting it meant accepting the necessity of changes that were politically costly. He described the years that followed with the same precision. The failed international agreements. The regional conflicts that had metastasized out of resource competition that the UN Ferris assessment had accurately predicted. The flooding of coastal cities, 4 of them in the first decade, 11 more in the second, that had generated refugee movements on a scale that tested every political system they touched. We lost approximately 340 million people in the period between 2041 and 2071, he said. Not all of them directly to the consequences the assessment predicted. Some to the secondary effects. Conflicts over resources, displacement, infrastructure failure. The assessment had modeled this too. It called it the cascade probability, the likelihood that a civilization recognizing an existential threat too late would generate secondary crises through its own reactive behavior that would compound the primary crisis. He paused. The assessment was right about the cascade. It was slightly wrong about the timeline. We hit the cascade faster than the model predicted, which meant the worst of it compressed into a shorter period. In retrospect, the compression probably saved us. A slower collapse would have been easier to normalize. The translation was reaching the linguistics team on Kilo 7 in near real time, the 6-second delay agonizing for the people watching. Ostrovsky observed that the council members around the perimeter of the chamber had, at some point in the last several minutes, shifted their posture, a subtle change that Dr. Brzezinski, watching the recording later, would identify as the Veilhari equivalent of leaning forward. In 2068, Ease continued, a governance framework called the Kigali Compact was ratified by 31 nation-states representing approximately 4.2 billion people. It wasn't a perfect document. There were significant compromises built into it that weakened certain provisions, compromises made because the alternative was losing signatories and having no compact at all. The people who negotiated it knew they were building something imperfect. They built it anyway. He described the compact's implementation with the same unsparing accuracy. The years when it seemed to be working. The years when it seemed to be failing. The internal crises, the 2074 defection of 2 major signatories, the subsequent emergency renegotiation, the 3-year period when the entire framework was effectively suspended while the fundamental disagreements at its core were renegotiated. It held, he said. Not because it was well designed, though it was better designed than what came before it. It held because enough people, in enough positions of actual authority, had personally witnessed enough of the cascade to be unwilling to go back. The knowledge was embodied. It wasn't abstract anymore. He stopped. Let the silence sit. I'm telling you this, he said, because the question you asked, whether we understand what we are, has an honest answer. We are a species that received an accurate warning about our own trajectory, spent 30 years arguing about it while the trajectory continued, experienced enough of the predicted consequences to recalibrate, and then, partially, imperfectly, with significant ongoing internal disagreement, changed enough to still be here. He looked at her directly. We are not a species that got it right. We are a species that got it wrong and survived the getting wrong and changed because of it. That's different. I think you know it's different. The chamber was very still. The champion had not moved from her position on the floor. Her expression, Ease had been watching it throughout, with the habit of someone trained to read nonverbal cues in people he couldn't talk to, had shifted several times during his account in ways he couldn't fully interpret. Not skepticism. Not surprise exactly. Something that might have been the Veilhari equivalent of recognition. She spoke. The translation came through carefully, Dr. Anand's voice precise. You did not tell me your history as it should have been. You told it as it was. Yes, Ease said. Most representatives tell me a version. A shaped version. They emphasize what survived and minimize what was lost. That would have been a waste of your time, he said. You've been doing this for 31 years. You would have recognized a shaped version. The faintest shift in her expression. Something that the exobiology team would spend weeks analyzing and eventually classify, cautiously, as rye. You are correct, she said. I would have. Pause. The 16 civilizations I found insufficient. Not all of them lacked capability. Several were more technologically advanced than your species at the time of assessment. Several had longer histories. The quality they shared was not weakness. It was a specific kind of incompleteness. She paused as if measuring whether to continue. They could describe themselves as they wished to be. They could not describe themselves as they were. She looked at him. You did something I have not encountered in 11 assessments. You described a failure before I asked about it. Without being prompted. You chose to include the parts that didn't work. Because they're the parts that matter, E said. The parts that work tell you about our luck and our resources. The parts that didn't work tell you about our character. About what we actually do when the situation is worse than we expected and the tools we prepared aren't adequate. And what do? He considered this for a moment. We argue about it, he said. And then we find something that works well enough, even if it isn't what we'd have chosen in better circumstances. And we remember what it cost. On Kilo 7, Colonel Nkemdarim had been standing with his arms crossed for the better part of an hour. He uncrossed them. He understood something we didn't, he said quietly to no one in particular. Ostrovsky looked at him. We spent 2 days trying to figure out what to demonstrate, Nkemdarim said. What to show them. He figured out that demonstration wasn't the point. The point was the thing underneath demonstration, whether what you show is actually what you are, or whether it's a constructed version of what you think you should be. He paused. The champion has been watching civilizations perform for 31 years. Every representative they've sent has stood up and showed her their best version. Their most composed version. Their most impressive version. He looked at the screen. And she's been waiting, for 31 years, for someone to just tell her what actually happened. Ostrovsky was quiet for a moment. Do you think it's enough? She asked. Nkemdarim watched the screen, where Corporal Emekes was sitting on the floor of an alien flagship, at eye level with a being who had decided the fate of 47 civilizations, speaking in the same tone he used when he was reading. I think, Nkemdarim said carefully, that it might be the first time she's heard an honest answer to the question she keeps asking. The deliberation took 9 hours. This was, according to the cultural data the Veilhari had transmitted, unusually long. The linguistics team cross-referenced every reference to previous assessments they had access to and found that the deliberation period was typically described in terms that suggested hours, not days, not minutes, but a period of sustained council engagement that had ranged, in the accounts available, from approximately 2 hours to 6. 9 hours was outside that range. No one on Kilo 7 could decide if that was good or bad. E spent the deliberation period in a room off the assessment chamber, comfortable by Veilhari standards, which meant well-lit and architecturally precise and calibrated for beings who did not need to sit down. He stood at the viewport for a while. Then he sat on the floor and read. He had loaded several texts onto his tablet before the transfer, an act that the station's crew had found either impressively composed or slightly baffling, and he read for approximately 3 hours. The conductors brought him water, or a substance with the chemical profile of water, in a container that had clearly been adapted for human grip proportions. He drank it. He thanked them, which was acknowledged with the same careful, deliberate mirroring gesture, hand flat against chest, that had been offered in the corridor on arrival. He did not ask what was happening. He did not transmit anything to Kilo 7 beyond a brief acknowledgement that he was in the holding room and had nothing to report. Ostrovsky had monitored the transmission protocols carefully enough to know that a different person might have filled 9 hours of silence with something. Reassurance, speculation, check-ins. E sent one message, 67 words, and then was quiet. The station's crew spent 9 hours in a controlled state of collective tension that Nkemdarim, who had experienced a number of high-stakes waiting periods in his career, described afterward as professional. Which was his way of saying, no one panicked, no one was certain, and everyone did their job because doing their job was the thing they had control over. The champion returned to the assessment chamber alone. No council members. No conductors. Just Vane Sorithkale, standing in the center of the space where she had sat on the floor and told Eve about the first dead world the Convergence had ever found. Eve stood across from her. She looked at him for a moment before speaking, the same measured observation she had brought to the beginning of their meeting, but with something added to it that he had not seen at the start. He couldn't name it precisely. It was not warmth exactly. It was something closer to the expression a person gets when they have been looking for something for a long time and have found it in an unexpected place, and are still in the process of understanding what that means. She spoke. The translation took longer than usual, not because the linguistics team was struggling, Dr. Anand said afterward, but because they wanted to get it exactly right. The council has deliberated on what was witnessed in this chamber. We have discussed the words spoken and, more importantly, the manner of their speaking. We have discussed what it means that you sent to this assessment a person whose rank, by our understanding of your hierarchy, is low. Pause. This required significant discussion. In all previous assessments, the civilizations we encountered sent their highest-ranking representatives. Their most decorated. Their most formally credentialed. This is logical. You wish to show your best, and your structures of hierarchy are designed to identify your best. She met his eyes. But the council observed something. Your representative was not sent because he was the most powerful. He was sent because he was, as best we could determine, the most honest. And the council has reached a conclusion that required us to revisit several of our own assumptions. He's waited. A civilization that can correctly identify the difference between impressive and honest, and choose honest in the highest stakes moment it has yet faced, has demonstrated a quality that is more rare than we had expected to find. The chamber was completely still. The Veilhari Convergence will seek formal relations with your people, she said. This is not a conditional offer. It is not subject to further assessment at this time. The council is in agreement. She paused. I have one additional statement which is not from the council. It is from me. He's waited. In 31 years and 47 assessments, I have asked the same question every time. Do you understand what you are? No civilization has ever answered it directly. They have answered the question they wished I had asked, about their strength, their history, their potential. You answered the question I actually asked. She was quiet for a moment. I was beginning to suspect that the question itself was the problem. That it was unanswerable, or that the answer was always incomplete, or that the very act of asking it introduced a performance that made honesty impossible. She looked at him with an expression that the exobiology team would spend weeks trying to classify and finally describe, imprecisely, as relief. You have suggested to me that the question is answerable. That is, in its way, a more significant contribution to this process than anything your government or your fleet or your technological capacity could have provided. The formal diplomatic communication was transmitted to Kilo 7 at 1847 station time, 9 hours and 42 minutes after Ease had entered the assessment chamber. It was delivered in Veilhari formal register, with a translation that the linguistics team had prepared in advance based on the protocol frameworks, a document that had existed in draft form for 2 years, designed for a moment that most of its authors had not expected to actually arrive. Commander Ostrovsky read it in the operations center, surrounded by her crew, with the particular stillness of someone who is absorbing information too large to process all at once. The Veilhari Convergence was formally requesting the establishment of a diplomatic exchange framework. They were proposing a neutral station, not Kilo 7, a new facility jointly constructed, as the site of ongoing communication. They were transmitting, as an initial act of good faith, a partial record of the civilizations they had encountered, not including those they termed reclassified, but including detailed accounts of the 31 that had proceeded to positive relations, with specific reference to the qualities that the convergence valued in those interactions. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary offer. The last item in the transmission was not part of the formal diplomatic communication. It was a personal notation, flagged as such, from Vane Sorithkale. Your representative asked me at the conclusion of our exchange one question. He asked whether I had, in 31 years of conducting this assessment, ever found a civilization that genuinely surprised me. I told him yes. He asked what had happened to it. I told him that it was one of the 31. He nodded. He did not ask which one. I thought you should know that he did not ask. Corporal Emike returned to Threshold Station Kilo 7 at 21:03 station time. He came through the docking bay, crossed into the operations center where every off-duty crew member had found a reason to be present, and stood for a moment in the doorway taking in the room. Commander Ostrovsky crossed to him. She extended her hand. He shook it. A small, completely human gesture in a room that had spent 9 hours waiting for the outcome of first contact with a civilization that spanned a significant portion of the galaxy. Corporal, she said. Commander. The council approved the diplomatic framework. I know, he said. She told me before I left. She looked at him for a moment. Was there a moment when you weren't sure how it was going to go? He considered this with the same honesty he appeared to bring to every question. Yes, he said. When she asked me to show her what we are. Before I decided to sit down. There were maybe 3 or 4 seconds where I was genuinely uncertain. What made you decide? He thought about it. I remembered what you said. About coming back. He paused. And I thought, if I perform and it works and they extend diplomatic relations, then we've started something important on a foundation that isn't true. And sooner or later, the Veilhari are going to find out who we actually are. And the gap between the performance and the reality is going to be the first thing we have to overcome before we can do anything real together. He paused. It seemed better to just be the thing we actually are. From the beginning. Even if the thing we actually are is complicated and has a lot of failures in it. Ostrovsky held his gaze. Did it occur to you, she said quietly, that the thing we actually are might not have been enough? Ease was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. But if it wasn't enough, then we needed to know that. And we'd need to figure out how to become enough. He paused. That's what we do. He excused himself politely and went to get something to eat. The formal diplomatic mission established by the Cali 7 Accord, named for Threshold Station Kilo 7, launched 14 months after that first contact, carrying a delegation of 11 people to the jointly constructed neutral station that the Veilhari had already begun construction on before the human team arrived. The Veilhari, it turned out, had been confident in their assessment. They had started building before the deliberation was finished. Colonel Nkemdarim read that detail in the mission debrief and sat with it for a long time. A civilization that had assessed 47 worlds, watched 16 of them reach a different outcome, and still started building the diplomatic station before the vote was counted. He thought about what that meant. And then he thought about a corporal who had sat down on the floor of an alien flagship and decided, in 3 or 4 seconds of genuine uncertainty, that honesty was a better foundation for the future than performance. He wrote one sentence in his personal log that night, the first personal entry he had made in 6 months. Maybe the question was never whether they would find us impressive enough. Maybe the question was always whether we would find ourselves clearly enough to tell the truth about what we are. He closed the log. Outside the viewport of Threshold Station Kilo 7, the stars were exactly where they had always been. But they were different now. Everything was.